My name is Jamie Morgan Kane, and this is my story on how the life I had was not my life. I was born on the Isle of Man. It sits midway between Ireland and England in the Irish Sea. My grandparents married on the isle in 1911, though they were from England, not from there. And they ended up owning hotels on the island. One of the notable things was in 1939, my grandparents hosted the German Nazi TT team, and last year before the war. And then in 1954, the year I was born, the first year the German team was allowed back, and they stayed at my grandparents at another one of their hotels that they owned. My dad was an RAF veteran, and he suffered from the war because he was in Birmingham during the Blitz of Birmingham. And though he never went to combat, he was involved in pulling children, people out of burning buildings and bombed out hospitals and stuff. Part of the thing was that my mother's family was Church of England from Birmingham. My dad's father was Roman Catholic. In the 1940s, those two are not supposed to go together. So my mother had to convert to Catholicism to be with my dad. But the moment she did that, her whole family disowned her. She was dead to them because you just didn't do that. My parents got married in 1946. My dad, like I say, would have these bouts of struggling, what we call PTSD today. 1954, rationing from the war was still going on. And anyway, my father went through one of his moments. He filed for divorce a month before I was born and left the isle, never returned. My mother had me, but with everything else, because when my dad filed for divorce, my grandmother threw her out of her job at the hotel, and I was actually born in a little hovel, which is like a little shack, rundown shack, where elderly women who had no family in the isle, government would put them there and give them some money for a stipend. And so I was midwifed. Because of that situation, and because my mother's mental state was not good, my birth never got registered. My mother did get my baptism registered, but my birth didn't get registered until this year on my 68th birthday. The Isle of Man finally registered my birth. Did a full page article in the newspaper. And then my mother, 2 weeks after that, had me baptized in my grandparents' Catholic parish. And then 2 weeks later, she left me on my grandparents' doorstep and left the isle, never to return. Because my grandparents were not of the isle, they were what referred to as come-overs. They didn't want the rumors and innuendos of my birth and what happened with my family, because as Catholic, my father went through a civil divorce rather than a church divorce. So that was a stain. My grandmother entrusted me to this young girl named Martha Virginia Boswell, who had been caring for me, to take me to Ottawa, Canada, to an orphanage there. One of the things about Martha Boswell is that she was of the Gypsy clan, the travelers that used to come to the Isle since the 1850s. We went to Liverpool. We met up with 11 Irish nuns, 11 Irish children and 2 Irish nuns. And the reason we did this, I've come to find out, was that in 1950, the English government had stopped allowing British children to be sent away from England without government permission. But by putting me with a bunch of Irish children, nobody would know the difference. We went to the orphanage. The orphanage was called St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum in Ottawa, and it was ran by the Grey Nuns of the Cross, which I've always pointed out was kind of a warm and fuzzy sounding place to be. Martha had seen what was going on. One of the things she discovered was that this orphanage was one of the orphanages involved what's later become known as the Duplius orphan scandal, where they were selling children to become indentured servants for Canadian farmers. And since my birth mother, had given her passport to give to me when I turned 18, in case I wanted cookie crumbs to find my way home, she took me illegally in the United States and took my mom's picture out of the passport, put her picture in, and took over using my mom's identity. So for the next 13 years, I grew up under my birth name, but thinking she was my birth mom because she used my birth mom's name. And we traveled from what I understand, down the east coast of America, across the south, we got to Arizona. And in Arizona, I was introduced, I was about 4.5 or so. I was introduced to a woman that I call Grandma Toby. She was an English woman. We've come to find out many years later that she was actually known to my grandmother, and my grandmother had made arrangements for us to go there. She taught me to read, write, do all my arithmetic. She taught me geography. She taught me world history. She taught me folklore, everything. Here's the thing. When I was with Mom, sometimes we didn't eat. So, we were poor. When I was with Grandma Toby, I always ate. Grandma Toby always made sure I was fed. My mom had other friends that sometimes she'd leave me with. A couple times I got left on a Native American reservations in Arizona. And so I got to experience that, but looking like I did with blue eyes. And at that time I had brown hair with copper streaks and stuff. And I definitely stood out. It was funny because I never thought that I had an unusual life. I just didn't know what a normal life was. She always came back for me. No matter where she left me, she always came back. But she was gone sometimes for a month or so. And then we'd be together for a few weeks, and then she'd go off again. One day, she got me all cleaned up, and she told me, we've got to go somewhere and we got to meet some people. And we walked over to a Carnation ice cream sundae store. And we walked in, and this couple got over and walked to us. And she said, this is Dr. Wetmore, and this is his wife, Alice. And I need to talk to these people. And I want you to go over there and sit down. Okay. And we'll be back over in a minute. And then Alice walked with me and she said, would you like an ice cream sundae? And then I remember him getting up. He gave Martha an envelope. Martha walked over to me and she said, be very good to these people. You're going to be staying with them for a while. Do what they say, and I'll be back to get you. Alice puts her arm around me and says, come on, we gotta get to the car. And we're walking out. And I said, what about my mom? And he says, don't worry, you're never going to see her again, right? You're now ours. And then I got home and they told me that they had just adopted me and that my name from this point forward be John Raymond Wetmore, and that this is now your birthday. I didn't want to go in Air Force because he had been Air Force, Dr. Wetmore. I wanted to be a Marine, but I was, because of my size at that time, I didn't think I was tough enough to be able to be a Marine. And decided to tell Dr. Wetmore at a dinner party when he had a bunch of friends there, including some congressmen who he had been vying to get them to get me an appointment to the Air Force Academy at the right time. And it didn't go over very well. He actually knocked me down and, chased me out of the house and all this stuff because I had sorely embarrassed him and wounded his pride. February 14th, 1976. I was getting out of the military September of 76. My wife was pregnant with my first child and was due in October of 76. At that time, I had started making my plans to get into being a motorcycle mechanic, and had me a shop. The first time I got any kind of information about the fact that I wasn't adopted and things that I thought were happening were not true anyway, was when I was going through a divorce with my first wife, and we were going to have a custody battle over my son. And Dr. Wetmore had called me to come see him and had, in a certain way, kind of demanded that I give him my parental rights on my son so he could raise my son and get him into the finest schools and make him a great lawyer. At his rage, he threw an envelope at me, told me I wasn't a U.S. citizen, told me I wasn't his son, told me he never wanted to see me again and to get off his grass. So inside the envelope was my baptism certificate from the Isle of Man, proving that I actually was born on the Isle of Man, and my mother's passport, though it was my birth mother's passport that the woman who raised me as my mother had put her picture in and used that once she had brought me into the U.S. I ended up losing my son in the custody battle. Dr. Wetmore did provide some financial support to the lawyers to make sure I couldn't get him, and really limited my chance of visitation. After getting my documents and everything, one of the first things I started doing in 1979 was I started taking back my birth name, which at that time was Morgan James Kane. I actually didn't know a lot more about my history of the Isle and stuff till many years later, when I was in when I was in prison, because there's an organization over here called Prisoners Abroad that supports British prisoners in prisons all around the world. I was their longest client, 17 years. And they got me a pen pal. And that person had been an investigator for the British government. And they started investigating some of the things I told them, because they told me never to lie to them. So I never did. But I told them the truths I knew, which they realized were not truths. And they knew that they were the ones to find out who my birth mother was, what my father's name was, who my family was. And being that my family, whose last name spelling Kane, K-N-E, from 1911 till 1971, we were the only family on that isle with that spelling of Kane. It was during the time that I started finding out all this about my family, I started having really mixed emotions. One was my family seemed to be very well attached to the Isle and were very lovingly thought of. But at the other time, I kept wondering, what were these people really like if they could send a 6-month-old child halfway around the world and forget them? So I kept wondering, what did I do wrong? October 2019, I go back to the Isle for the very first time. And we filmed me going back, and it's on YouTube. And I'm getting very emotional as I see the land coming out of the ocean and coming through the clouds. And I hear him say, "Welcome to the Isle of Man." And when I stepped off the plane, I breathed in the air, and it was really a cold, windy day, but I got this warmth feeling inside, and I felt like I was being welcomed home. I was having my first emotional tie to the island came when I was 65 years old. And I've now been back 5 times to the Isle. That right there. Yeah. And at 68 years old, I have the latest birth registry in the UK. I would say to anybody who has questions about where they're from, who their family are, their circumstances that they found themselves in that were not necessarily their original circumstances, that just believe in yourself. You have to have a certain amount of love for yourself in knowing that you have value. And if you really want to pursue things, know ahead of time, now that I've gone through it, that it may not turn out the way you want. But that's not a mark against you. That's someone else's has to deal with that. But don't give up if you really want to search. Don't give up if you really want to know. Realize that no matter how bad things are right this moment, and just like British weather, give it 30 minutes, it could change, and things just get better. So I'd really like to thank everybody for listening to my story. I hope that people found something to take away from it. I appreciate your time.